Okay, this meeting is being recorded. So we are being recorded. We're recording everything. This is great. There it goes. Welcome to session number one of Genesis in Depth. I'm Dr. John McMath, joined here by my friends in Italy and the Philippines and here at home in North Idaho. Uh, this course is a college level introduction to the theology, the history, the archaeology of the book of Genesis. It's aimed at a uh, fairly advanced uh, layman's level. This is for people who've been through a survey of Old and New Testament and have had some other background. So that would be everybody in the Zoom audience, uh, and others. If you're outside of the LJPF community, you might want to look at some of the other videos in order to get context. Uh, but those who've been following are going to be more than ready for this material. It doesn't stand alone, though. If you need an introduction to some of the theological concepts that are developed in the book of Genesis, you may want to look at our Introduction to Christian Doctrine course or the Introduction to Worldviews and Apologetics. You'll find particularly the doctrines of the authority and inerrancy of the Bible. We're going to assume those things. And if you respond to a video online with a critique uh, of the conservative positions that I'm going to be teaching, um, please be aware that I've already answered those questions, and you may want to go take a look at some of those other videos before you throw rocks. Welcome to everyone. It's good to have you together. I see the clans are gradually coming together here. This is all good. We're going to uh, launch right in. This background, of course, is an artist's rendition of what the Earth looks like from the moon. The Earth is a relatively small place on a universal scale. The moon is an even smaller place, and yet we find the Earth and the moon and the sun have a prominent place in Genesis. The book of Genesis would seem to indicate that the heavens and the earth were all created at the same time. We'll define the word created later. I'll show you what that means. But God made it all uh, at at His command in an instant, and there was heaven and earth, and the earth is in a privileged position. As far as we know from Scripture, the earth is the only location in the universe where God created thinking beings, human beings. It is conceivable, I suppose, that there is life on other planets, but probably not anything above the bacterial level. Uh, there's no reason to believe that. There's no evidence for that, uh, but there is biblical evidence that the Earth is unique in possessing human life, intelligent life, or at least theoretically intelligent life. I have my questions about some, but this whole story begins with the presupposition that God, in His omnipotent eternality, chose to make Himself visible with a created universe. Uh, and that's the beginning point. The Bible does not begin with an argument for the existence of God. The Bible doesn't start by providing 10 logical steps to help us conclude that there is a God. The Bible simply assumes God, it presupposes an eternal God who can be nothing but uh, the the author of the universe. Uh, that's Genesis in a nutshell. And everything that follows from that, everything that flows from that in the biblical narrative, presupposes first the existence of God and the fact of the creation, and then the fact of sin and of redemption and of the creation of the nation of Israel. God did all of those things as uh, a simple act of his will. He spoke the words, and all of this came into being. And that's foundational. And everywhere else that we go in the Bible, we're going to be realizing that the Genesis foundations lay the brickwork that supports our other developments. If we want to talk about the sinfulness of mankind, we're inevitably going to have to go back to the Garden of Eden. If we want to talk about redemption, we're inevitably going back to Genesis. If we want to talk about the nature of the biblical call and the relationship with God, we have to go back to Genesis. How does salvation happen? We're going to go back to Genesis. So this study is going to take us considerably beyond what we got in our initial steps. And we're going to begin seeing how Genesis forms the core of biblical theology. Uh, I think you're going to enjoy this. But let's go ahead and get in. I'm going to share the screen. I think that's what I want to do. Yes, of course it is. There we go. Oh, there. That's the one. Bingo. Doing it. There it goes. My internet is very slow today. Internet is very slow today. So, um, welcome to the book of Genesis. Uh, the the title Genesis means beginning in Greek. When the Septuagint was translated, the the Greek translators felt the need for a title for each of their books. Most of our titles for the Old Testament books come from the Greek translation of the Septuagint. Geneseos means beginning in Greek. In Hebrew, the book is simply called Bereshit. Bereshit is the Hebrew for in the beginning. So the Greek title is actually a good title for it. The Hebrew books tended to be named after a portion of their first line. So in the beginning, Bereshit is good. The others are the same. The book of Exodus is not titled Exodus. That's a Greek title. It actually has a different title taken from the first line of the book. So we'll start off here. The beginning describes a book which exists to explain the beginnings of everything that is. Now let's think about that for just a moment. Uh, for an explanation to be useful, uh, it has to be provided by somebody who actually knows. If you think about that for a moment, uh, if uh, if you come upon some strange structure in the forest, let's say you find a pile of rocks in a kind of a U shape with some logs set over the top of those rocks. It kind of looks like somebody has built a shelter there, maybe. Or perhaps there used to be a village here, and this is what's left of it. Or perhaps there was an earthquake, and these rocks just randomly fell in this particular pattern. We really don't know exactly what happened unless somebody who was there tells us what happened. You talk to a farmer nearby, and he says, "Oh, yes, my children, when they were growing up, were out in the woods playing, and I suppose they built a shelter there." Okay, then we know. Then we know. But if there were no eyewitnesses, we simply don't know. We're making guesses. Modern science uh, rejects out of hand, the non Christians amongst modern scientists at any rate, rejects out of hand the statements of Genesis. And so they assume that there is no God, that there was no creation, that the universe is many, many billions of years old, that evolution is the explanation for everything. Those are just assumptions. None of that has any basis in evidence. Those are assumptions that non believing scientists use as a foundation for the rest of their thinking. And from that point, they begin looking at the evidence to see how the evidence can be bent to support their points of view. That's not real science. It isn't. It isn't even very good storytelling. When we look at some of the pagan mythology, which we'll do in a bit, not today, but probably next week, we see that the pagans also tried to tell stories about the beginning, and some of their stories are just silly. I'll tell you the story of the Enuma Elish next week. It's just silly. Uh, it's there's some others like the Egyptian creation story that has to do with one of the gods spitting. Had- so the heaven and earth came into being because of the spitting of one of the gods. Um, it's actually funny when you read these things. Those things are just as likely as the scientists who presuppose that there is no God. Uh, the reason that we have an accurate account of the beginning is because the one who was there made a record. Oh, so this came to us from God Himself. We know that because Jesus believed that. Jesus taught that not a jot or a tittle will fall away from the law until all has been fulfilled. He believed that every detail of the Bible, specifically for him at that time, the Old Testament, uh, was accurate and should be understood literally. That includes Genesis. Jesus took the creation story as history. We see that in so many places. He speaks of Adam, he speaks of the fall, he speaks of the creation from the beginning of creation. Jesus assumed these things. And we could question that except for the fact that Jesus went to the cross and was raised on the third day. That demonstrates his authority. Um, when we're doing apologetics, we always end up coming back to the central miracle of Christianity, which is the resurrection. Now, for the Old Testament believers, there were the miracles of Moses. Moses talked to God. God revealed all of these things to Moses and, frankly, to the other uh, authors of Genesis. I'm going to put that in air quotes, who were before Moses. Uh, and these things were given by God specifically to Moses to produce the book of Genesis. Uh, this is the best kind of history. So Genesis means beginning, and the only eyewitness to the very beginning was God Himself. God has given us an accurate account of what He did during that first week. The author of the book of Genesis is Moses, uh, and he wrote also the rest of the Pentateuch. Pentateuch means the five rolls. Pentateuch is the first five books of the Old Testament. And when we look at the language and the grammatical structures and the syntactical structures of these five books of uh, the beginning of the Old Testament, we see the handwriting of Moses everywhere. Uh, the uh, the Hebrew that Moses used was the archaic Hebrew, very old Hebrew. Now, later on, the uh, Hebrew of both Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch was updated. The alphabetic system changed from the archaic alphabet to the uh, exilic era Aramaic square script. The grammar of uh, the Pentateuch was simplified somewhat from the original archaic uh, noun endings, particularly. And we see a lot of that. There's a simplification even in some of the verbal systems. And we can see that development all the way through the Old Testament. But anyone who knows how language works, reading through the book of Genesis in particular, will say to you, yes, this is really very antique Hebrew. This is old stuff. Uh, this is this is Moses, and we find the same style all the way through these five books that Moses wrote. His fingerprints are all over it. The modern era, of course, has seen scholars who have doubted Mosaic authorship, just as they've doubted the authorship of the entire Old Testament and the New Testament, for that matter. Uh, and they've decreed a set of uh, assured results of scholarship that I don't think are particularly assuring. But that's happened over the last 150 years. A fellow by the name of Julius Wellhausen, a German scholar 150 years ago, invented a system for the Pentateuch that we call the JEDP theory. He said that we started out with two documents, a J document and an E document, that were probably written in the fifth or sixth centuries BC. So 1,000 years after the events of Moses' life, and many thousands after the time of Genesis. And according to Wellhausen, uh, none of the events that are spoken of in the Pentateuch ever happened, and they were made up by a priestly writer by the name of J. He was the one who used the name for God Yahweh, and then there was another writer who we call E, who used the name of God Elohim. So Yahweh and Elohim are two different gods from two different traditions. And somebody along the way, some editor, decided to put the two books together and just kind of interleave Yahweh stories with Elohim stories, and sometimes Yahweh Elohim stories, just make it one story out of the two. And of course, that was never very satisfactory. So during the exile and the post exilic period, a fellow called the Deuteronomist, who, among other things, wrote the book of Deuteronomy in order to encourage people to live according to the mythology they already have. The Deuteronomist came back through and rewrote everything to make it all fit with his peculiar ideas about God. That was added to in the years before the New Testament was written by a priestly source. The priestly source was really interested in rituals and sacrifices and temple worship and those sorts of things. So he came back through and added passages wherever it seemed right to him to add passages. There's no evidence to support a theory like that. No manuscript evidence, no archaeological evidence, no extra biblical evidence. There's literally nothing at all that would support that. There are um, lots of studies that have demonstrated from, particularly from archaeology in other languages like Ugaritic and Sumerian, that demonstrate that ancient books were never produced this way. It's it, it's a theory that is built on a foundation of sand and really doesn't work. The theory is continuing to be popular amongst the critics and, of course, uninformed lay people out in the mainline denominational churches, and even in Roman Catholicism. The JEDP theory is popular, and lots and lots of people have never heard anything else. So I'm here to tell you that the JEDP theory is essentially garbage science. Uh, it should never have been um, accepted into the academic world to begin with. That it continues to be there is kind of embarrassing to those of us who've actually studied the material. Uh, One of the most important parts of the documentary hypothesis is evolution. Uh, of course, uh, what's his name? Charles Darwin, the character on the left looking at the monkey. Charles Darwin invented biological evolution. Or actually, he developed it from some others who had thought about this before. But Darwin came up with a way of explaining the existence of life and mankind itself without necessarily having a God. And that became enormously popular in liberal circles in the 19th century. And it was out of that same background that uh, so called biblical scholars began assuming a societal and a theological or religious evolution. Religion is supposed to have evolved from a Stone Age fear of noises in the dark. And eventually people named the noises that they heard in the dark. And after a while, priests developed who told stories about the bumps and groanings and screechings in the dark. And that became the foundation of primitive religion, which eventually turned into the religions of antiquity and so on. And Judaism and later Christianity are simply the later developments of this whole evolutionary thing. Uh, it the theory has been destroyed so many times by archaeological and manuscript evidence that it doesn't seem to be worthwhile doing that anymore. Yet, uh, if you go to a major university that has a religion department, you won't find anything else. Just about everywhere in the world. So at any rate, I'm going to assume that Moses wrote Genesis because that's simply sensible. Now, I do need to talk about the sources of Genesis, and that's what I mean by this thing in blue that says Toledot. Toledot um, is a Hebrew word, part of the phrase Ela Toledot. These are the generations. Let me give you that structure. These are the generations in Hebrew. Ela, these are Toledot, the generations. We find that 10 times in Genesis. Some scholars have suggested that the Toledot passages are transitions, the major and minor turnings of the Genesis story. They divide the book up into 11 sections. Uh, Toledot comes from a Hebrew word yalad, which is to give birth to something or someone, or to generate something. So we would translate these are the generations, or here's what this event gave birth to, or was the foundation of. We could transliterate in modern language. We could say, here is what became of X. So these are the generations of the heavens and the earth, or here's what became of the heavens and the earth, or here's what became of Adam, or here's what became of Esau, or here's what became of Abraham. And it's not really a title for the next section, but it serves as a transitional structure. It is really, really helpful. Now, uh, some scholars have suggested that the Toledotes mark separate primitive documents used by Moses in the final creation of the text of Genesis. And that was originally suggested by a really great scholar, a man to whom we must always listen, named Donald Wiseman. Uh, and uh, he called this the document hypothesis, which shouldn't be confused with the higher critical documentary hypothesis, which we were just talking about. The document hypothesis for Genesis holds that there were 11 original documents written by people like Adam and Noah and the other characters in the Old Testament uh, as records of what had happened to them and what took place during their lives. Uh, and that's uh, uh, that idea says that these documents came down to Moses and were collected by Moses to put into the final book of Genesis. Uh, the theory is attractive. I, that there's a lot to like about it, since it explains where Genesis came from. If we don't hold to a theory like that, it would be necessary to suggest some kind of oral tradition or some kind of direct revelation from God. Now, both of those are, in fact, real possibilities. God really does directly reveal, and oral tradition is a real thing that was very effective in the ancient world. There are some key problems with the Toledot theory. Uh, and I don't know that it kills it, but we should take it with a grain of salt. First, the Toledot passages are not parallel or even structured like separate documents. Uh, it, in fact, looks from a study of Genesis as though the text is a unit. It all works together. So if the Toledot passages are uh, introductions to separate texts, uh, they've been manipulated by Moses to fit into one coherent, flowing storyline. And that I think is a major problem. Uh, the other problem with the Toledot theory is that there aren't any literary or archaeological evidences for those documents. I mean, there's simply nothing there. By archaeological evidence, I mean some stone tablet with the third Toledot passage in it. Um, uh, that would confirm the Toledot theory. But we don't have anything like that. There's no tradition that suggests that that's true. So it's very likely that Moses worked from older tradition, very likely, but he was operating under the power of the inspiration of God. So there's a confluence here of uh, prior documents. I don't have any problem with uh, Adam or Noah or the others writing. I think that's very likely. Uh, and those came down to Moses. Moses used them as he saw fit. And he uses Toledot as the um, as a literary device to say, this is what was, and here's what's coming next. It's interesting that Genesis is the only book in the Bible that uses this structure. So perhaps this is a really, really old way of introducing chapters or introducing a change in the narrative. So that's what we think. As far as uh, Toledot, we can understand it. When we see these are the generations of, we should note this as a transition. It's a literary structure. Uh, Something has gone. Now we're going to see what happens as the uh, next step. Bruce Waltke uh, is the strongest defender of the literary structure theory of the Toledot passages. Bruce Waltke is a brilliant Old Testament scholar that I don't agree with on everything. I do agree with him on just about everything. He particularly quotes a Roman Catholic scholar, Umberto Cassuto, and a modern Protestant scholar, Gary Rensdorf, who support the theory and have done a lot of the foundational work. So the Toledotes, we'll notice them. There's no way to assume them. Now, as far as authorship, we know that Genesis is a part of the Pentateuch. It's a unity. The same author is responsible for the whole book. But there seems to be, most likely is, according to this again is Bruce Waltke's uh, explanation of how Genesis came into being. Uh, he said there probably is an Genesis. The term is a German prefix that means that which existed before. So before Moses wrote Genesis, there were sources. And there was probably a set of documents that were handed down to Moses. Uh, the rest of the Pentateuch, Exodus through Deuteronomy, are clearly by and about Moses. Moses had the training in the background to make him the likely suspect of being the author of those four books. But for Genesis, Moses clearly used sources, just like any historian would. And we're told of several of these. In Genesis 5, we're told of the Toledot of Adam's line. And later on in the book of Numbers, we're told about a complete document that existed at the time of Moses called the Book of the Wars of the Lord. Well, where was that, and why don't we have that anymore? But we have some quotes from that, uh, and very likely there were other written traditions, written sources, and oral traditions, but not necessarily of the Toledot variety. Uh, we don't think there were 11 documents necessarily. I think Moses just used that as a way of dividing up his material. Uh, Now, this should be contrasted with the evolutionary theories. Uh, the uh, the critics believe that the Bible simply evolved with no God involved at all. The change of the divine name, the redactors, all of that assumes atheism, denies inspiration and authority. But when we're talking about the stages of composition of the book of Genesis, we're talking about how God superintended the process of bringing this story down to Moses, and then how Moses used his sources to produce the finished product. The finished product is a very well unified story. And as we walk our way through it, you'll see how that works. The book of Genesis under Moses was very quickly put into a more or less final form. Over the centuries, the book of Genesis was edited. Uh, we have no questions about that. To add specific details, will occasionally some little note that explains a name or explains a location that no longer exists. Sometimes we see a correction of an anachronism. So in chapter 14 of Genesis, there's a mention of a place called Dan, which didn't get that name until roughly 500 years later. In uh, chapter 36, there's a mention of the kings of Israel. That's a note that was added by a later editor. All of this has to be understood as a part of the inspiration process. Uh, Part of the rest that was changed in Genesis is spelling and grammar. The very earliest stages of Hebrew written in the archaic script were also spelled different. They used the vowels in a different way, and I'm not going to try to teach you the grammar of archaic Hebrew, but the vowels were used in a different way, and the case endings were explicit. That disappears from the later Hebrew, and those changes were definitely made to Genesis, although we see a lot of the remnants of those earlier systems. So uh, that wasn't all put into its absolutely final form until after the Babylonian captivity, when the scribes, we've heard of the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites of the New Testament, uh, those scribes are called Masoretes, and they put the Bible into its final form prior to the New Testament. And we can still see the results of that scribal work today. We see it in the footnotes in our Hebrew Bibles. And that's really a pretty cool thing. So let's talk about literary genre. First of all, uh, Genesis is history. Genesis provides the historical framework for understanding God's dealings with the human race in general and his work with Israel in particular. There are lots of details missing. As in any good history book, there are details missing that we might even be interested in. So people ask, well, where did Cain get his wife? And that's a great question. And the Bible doesn't answer that. And people wonder why. The reason why is that God didn't think that was important for us to know. And it's still a problem today, but it's a problem that God doesn't think was important enough to bother with. So where did he find his wife? We don't know. How many kinds are there? A kind doesn't seem to be the same as a species or a family or whatever the modern divisions of animals and plants might be. Uh, Genesis simply uses the word kinds, and we don't know. Uh, but it provides a theological foundation. So animals were able to reproduce according to their kind, whatever that was. Maybe horses and zebras are, in fact, related. They're different species, but maybe they're the same kind. I don't really know. And the Bible doesn't seem to really care. Now, Genesis is not history in the modern sense of scientific historiography. So a modern, particularly secular historian uh, will pay little or no attention to uh, God's purposes in history. Okay, he's he's interested in just the just the data on the ground, what actually happened, and God is ignored. The author of Genesis was obviously uh, trying to lay things out, lay the events out in a coherent sequence of events to produce a narrative framework. And so, in that sense, Genesis is historical literature, no question about that. But Genesis also provides a theological framework. Moses obviously believed in God and believed that he was repeating and recording the very words of God. So there is theological intention. The Germans have a word for this, and it hasn't been used in the right way. But the German word is Heilsgeschichte, holy history. So it is history, but with an understanding of God's work in the midst of that history. Uh, it recognizes Genesis, for example, as uh, legitimate history that recognizes the place of God. Now, later German critical scholars using Heilsgeschichte have used that as a slam. Oh, this is just holy history, which means it's something written by believers to explain God's work in the world and is therefore not to be trusted. But as we will see as we work through Genesis, Moses is telling the story, and from his position as the evaluator of the story from God's wise point of view, he's explaining why it's important and how it's important. So, Genesis is a coherent sequence of events in a narrative framework. So, Genesis is certainly historical literature. It is not it is not mythology. Um, what the critics are trying to argue when they attack the historicity of Genesis is that if Genesis is not reliable as to historical statements, it's not reliable, period. If that's true, then the Bible itself is not reliable, since the whole rest of the Bible assumes the essential truth of the details of Genesis. If you work later on into the Bible, Isaiah in the Old Testament in particular, depends on the notion of the creation, looks forward to the reality of a new creation at the end of time. So creation and new creation are the parentheses, the bookends for all of history. That's the story that Genesis begins. Isaiah picks up on that. Jesus talks about the creation. The authors of the New Testament assume the creation narratives, the Abraham narratives, the Jacob narratives, the Joseph narratives. All of this forms a part of the foundation of the essential truth of ancient history, particularly the history prior to Moses. So, as we look at this book, one, we have to understand that Genesis is certainly not poetry. It uses poetic uh, tools in some places, but anyone who can read Hebrew will look at Genesis and will be able to tell in an instant with no difficulty at all that this is meant to be narrative or history and not poetry. And we do this by simply looking at believe it or not, the accents on the words. We sometimes think that an accent just provides, some way of knowing how to pronounce each word. The pronunciation of the word depends on its place in the sentence, and poetry has a different set of accent marks to help us understand how the poetry is divided up and where it should be accented, where how the sounds should work. Uh, Narrative, as in history, is pointed with a different kind of accent marks. It's a whole different set. And they're more on the order of commas and semicolons and periods. It lays it out not in a poetic structure, but in a simple narrative structure. Genesis is written as history, certainly not poetry. Some argue that Genesis is mythology. Now, in literary theory, mythology is a story that includes gods. Uh, Genesis does not function the way mythology functions. If we were to compare Genesis with ancient mythology, say the stories that come out of Mesopotamia or Egypt or the Hittite countries or even the Canaanites, we'll find that they are grossly different. It's a totally different kind of story. When you read the Baal mythology, you'll find it fragmentary, grossly immoral. You'll find it internally contradictory. You'll find a collection of stories that were told by a collection of soothsayers, none of whom uh, had any relationship with the God of reality. The book of Genesis does not read like mythology. And anyone who's spent time looking at mythology will be able to tell the difference. Genesis reads like history. Thirdly, Genesis is not legend. A legend is a story that grows up over time about someone who may or may not have actually existed, but who is characteristic of an era, like the King Arthur stories are legendary. It is very likely that no Anglo-Saxon king named Arthur actually lived or had a round table with knights who met regularly to discuss their chivalry. The stories were written during the Middle Ages, mostly by the church, in order to encourage the noblemen of the Germanic tribes who had taken over the Roman Empire to behave morally and ethically when they went to battle. That's what a legend is for. That's what the myths of King Arthur are about. The mythology or the legends that grew up around Charlemagne are the same way. Most of this didn't really happen. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a legend. It didn't really happen. It is a fun story to read, but we know that a thing like that couldn't really happen. That's a legend. A fable is a story about uh, something important, usually some moral teaching that uses animals. So a fox and a rabbit were having a conversation. Well, we all know that foxes and rabbits don't talk and they don't have conversations. If they were to have a conversation, it would be very brief. This would involve the fox saying grace before lunch. Uh, so the book of Genesis is not a fable. Neither is it a fairy story. A fairy story is a very interesting and peculiar kind of story. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is in essence an extended fairy story. It's meant to convey some truth, even some eternal truth that's very important to the author. So with Tolkien's story, uh, he produce some very lifelike characters who don't really exist in the real world and who uh, are related with uh, elves and demons and all kinds of wizards and magic and the rest of it that doesn't really exist in the real world. And yet, through that storytelling method, Tolkien is able to develop some very important real world truths. The fairy story is a wonderful way of making a story happen, but Genesis is not a fairy story. It is, in fact, history and meant to be understood as history, even if it's not history in the modern scientific sense. It is ancient history. And so we should read it that way. Now, there's a bunch of things that are going on in Genesis. I'm going to go over this quickly, but later on, as we walk through the book, we're going to see all of this happening. Poetics, for example, the use of figures of speech or word pictures, sometimes a rhythmic sequence of words of thought and sound. Uh, Moses is a really, really good writer. And we see the poetics primarily in Hebrew. And so I won't always bother you with it, but I'll note it once in a while because you'll see how Moses has a tendency to draw word pictures. Uh, he's uh, he's actually really astute. We think of him as a professional literary type. The lead word, sometimes called a keyword, is a word that's repeated in significant places to emphasize a point. So we're going to see some words that are fairly important as it comes around. For instance, the curse and the blessing. Well, that's going to come up often. The idea of grace is going to come up. The idea of faith, the idea of sin. we're going to see the uh, keywords used repeatedly. Uh, and this allows us to come back to the theological background that the writer is trying to give us. A refrain is a repeated phrase used to make a point. Uh, and we'll see how that works. We'll see how particularly in the genealogies, and so lived such and such a number of years and had sons and daughters. And after that, he lived such and such years. And he lived a total of however many years, and he died. And you'll see the phrase, and he died, in every one. Mortality, the promise to Adam, if you eat from this tree, you will surely die. And he died, and he died, and he died. From one generation to the next, mortality is passed on as a sacrament of sin. I'll show you what that means as we get into the text. Contrast. Often two stories or two characters differ significantly, and there's an effect. So we see Jacob and Esau, for example, and how different these brothers are in spite of other things. Uh, uh, Often characters are directly contrasted. Comparison is an evaluation of two characters or two stories to make a point. Comparison is a little different than contrast. Often, comparison and contrast are used together in our thought. Logic is a movement of evidence to reach valid conclusions. And we see Moses telling a story and coming to a logical and valid conclusion at the end of it. That's an important thing for historians to do. Climax or the intensification of a story until it comes to the point of resolution is a standard plot device. Uh, and it's something that isn't always used by historians, but probably should be. Moses uses the plot device of a climax regularly in all kinds of ways. In the flood narrative, for example, the flood intensifies and it carries on, and finally comes to the climax of sending out the birds. First a raven, then a dove. And we finally come to the resolution after that as they land on the mountain. Uh, these are standard plot methods. That doesn't mean that Moses is writing fiction. It means that Moses is a good writer and he's helping us to see what's going on. There are more things going on. Patterns is a repeated sequence or repeated structure. We'll see that fairly regularly. The Janus device. Janus is the two-headed god or the two-faced god. He's looking back and looking forward. So here's a point. Now we look back uh, on one character and we begin looking forward into the next character, and there's a Janus moment. It's generalization and particularization. A generalization is a statement of a truth in the abstract. And then in the story that follows, we see the truth in practice. We're going to see that a lot in the Joseph narrative. Foreshadowing also in the Joseph narrative. So Joseph has a dream. He's got uh, his sheaves standing up and their sheaves bowing down, and then he has the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him. I wonder why that is. Well, he's looking forward to what will come at the end. A summarization is a looking back. We see this also in the Joseph narrative. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. He summarizes the whole conflict between Joseph and his brothers. The inclusio is a pattern of words or sometimes events at the beginning and the end of a sequence. I'll show you those when it happens. An intercalation is a structure put in the middle of a story for effect. So in the Joseph story, we have the beginning of the Joseph story, and then the story of Judah and Tamar, which is just disgusting. And then the Joseph story picks up again. Well, what's that doing there? It's for contrast. It allows us to compare. And Moses put it there deliberately. This is not some kind of mistake by the late editors. This is Moses writing literature. And then finally, irony, a statement that's completely out of place. It just it makes your eyebrows go up, and I'll show you those as we come to them. So what what is going on in this whole development of Genesis is really narrative theology. Is producing a narrative that includes the story and a discourse. And I'm using the terms technically. The story is the sequence of events, beginning with the creation and running all the way through the Joseph narrative. Moses is telling a story, the sequence of things that happen, the facts on the ground as he describes them. Discourse is the rhetorical point behind the story. Uh, Moses is creating a mood. He's eliciting a reaction. He's stating a moral to the story, if you will. The discourse is the theological interpretation of the story. And as we're reading the story, we should be sensing the development of that theological interpretation because Moses is doing that all the way through. So there are always two layers to the story. The story itself, and then the discourse. What Moses is trying to teach us about God, about salvation, about sin, about society as a whole. Moses is producing a piece of art here that that teaches far beyond its mere words. Now, when we're doing this thing, we need to understand how it how it works, and that's the point of understanding the evaluative viewpoint. Who makes the evaluation on what is right, what is wrong, what is theologically true, and that would be the narrator. Moses acts all through Genesis as the narrator, and he's doing the evaluation on the basis of God's wisdom and God's worldview. Uh, uh, so we get this statement in Genesis 6. And every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Well, whose statement is that? That's Moses providing a theological interpretation of the events of the pre flood civilization from God's point of view. So the evaluative viewpoint is always going to be God's point of view. The narrator communicates his world and his life views, God's world views, through agency, direct statement, often God Himself, and the Lord said so and so, or sometimes and Moses responds as the narrator. Sometimes through poetics. Sometimes we're going to find that the style allows us to see the theological point of a passage. Sometimes gaps in the story that are obvious, sometimes anachronism, where things are out of their proper place because the theology demands that. Uh, I'll show you when those things happen. Uh, okay. Uh, the law of parsimony is sometimes called Occam's razor. The law of parsimony is simply stated, says that the simplest explanation for the text as we see it now is probably the best. The simplest explanation of the evidence is probably the best explanation. When we're doing theology with the biblical text, common sense is almost always the best approach. What does it actually say? What is Moses trying to develop from this? And the answer to that question should be looking for the simplest possible answer. Okay, when we uh, get together next week, we're going to continue on into uh, the book of Genesis itself. We'll get right into the text of Genesis. We're going to see that the great theme of Genesis in biblical theology is going to be developed when we get all the way over to Genesis 12 and the call of Moses. We're going to see the idea of the seed of the woman, the land, God's rule or kingdom, and finally the ruler himself, the messianic king who is to come. Uh, Genesis is a statement of the historical reality in the past that leads to a prediction of the theological outcome of all things. Genesis is extraordinarily important for our understanding of everything that we're going to see. We'll start at this slide next week and begin developing these ideas as we move into the text itself at Genesis 1. So I'm going to get out of this. Uh, I know this is hard stuff, and you'd rather get right into Genesis. And we will certainly do that next week. I'm going to unmute us all. Uh-oh. Who've I got joining me here in the lunar headquarters of LJPF? Here we are on the surface of the moon together, and our own Oscar Costello joins me here on the moon to say hi to everyone. Ciao, tutti. I didn't know that moon men could talk in English, but I'm certainly glad that they can. So bye bye everyone. We'll love y'all. We'll see you again next week. Does Donna want my picture? Yeah, we'll stay on for just a minute. I got to stay. Teresa, I see you there. Thanks for being here today. There's Sheila.
Yeah, I'm so
That's my.
excited to start Genesis.
Yeah, we're going to get started in Genesis now. We finished up prophecy, so here we are. Yes, I know, dear. They can't be helped. She's taking our picture. Okay. You're going to see a flash here in just a second. Okay. Bye bye, everyone. I'm going to end this for now. And we'll get back together again next week. And we'll get quite a lot farther into Genesis, maybe all the way through Genesis 1 1. We'll see. Bye bye. Love you. Lovey, I see you there. Bye bye. Ciao, ciao.